Adam is a Henry Fellow at Harvard. He's a former head of the Oxford Union. He studies history and politics. He sat in on my Frederick Douglass Lincoln seminar last semester, which is how I got to know him. He's brilliant, and he is wonderful to be around and to be with. Those are what I wanted to share before we jump in. I also, today is going to be a kind of hybrid day. The readings for this week were Roberto's The Overthrow of the Dictatorship of No Alternatives, which we'll discuss for the first hour. And next week, if you look at the syllabus on February 14th, it's the American Prophets, where you're reading Emerson, Whitman, Melville, and Lincoln. There are a number of other prophets we could use, but we selected those as their articulation of the United States from really the founding through the Civil War, because of the readings for next week. We wanted to begin discussing the nature of these prophets as a way to help you prep for next week.
And to have a discussion of Christianity in the United States as a preparation for the discussion of the American prophets.
Yeah. So the reason why we title it American Prophets is because of the comparatively profound religiosity of the United States. The United States, in the antebellum period and through today, is the most religious developed nation, if you see the United States as a developed nation. And that's one of the, it's the one thing that virtually all scholars suggest makes the United States exceptional, is that the religiosity, the degrees of religion in the United States eclipse that of virtually every other country or major nation. And a major part of it is the separation of church and state, which requires ministers and churches to compete in a capitalist marketplace. In virtually every other, most other European countries, they receive money from the government, so they are not, they do not need to compete in a capitalist marketplace. Let's begin with the overthrow of the dictatorship of no alternatives as a vision for how to transform the nation and really achieve a kind of democracy. Roberto describes it as a dictatorship of no alternatives, and he provides an alternative to it. As he points out, Fordist mass production has been replaced by today's most advanced practice of production, which is the knowledge economy, which excludes most workers and businesses. Most who regard themselves as progressives today are conservatives in the sense that they want to defend the institutional social democracy. Do you want to elaborate on?
Yes, I could state briefly the central thesis. First of all, this article is not about the United States. It's about the situation in the world, the ideological and institutional situation. Its starting point is the observation that the last moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the world, the last major institutional and ideological settlement, was the social liberal or social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century. that was prepared before the Second World War and then implemented more extensively after the Second World War. And that ever since then, there has been no institutional project of comparable dimension in the whole world. In the rich North Atlantic region, what remains established are the remains, the tattered remains of that settlement.
Right.
And in the rest of the world, the only institutional and ideological alternative clearly available is sometimes labeled an authoritarian state capitalism. So the world is restless under the yoke of this dictatorship of no alternative, looking. And the essay is devoted largely to the attempt to sketch in the broadest terms the character of an alternative and the social base that might support it. Any such alternative in the world, given that all the societies that exist in the world are class societies, would have to have the engagement of the national elite in some form or another. In most countries, the predominant element in the elite is some class of asset-owning rentiers, either financial rentiers or natural resource rentiers. And an alternative is only likely to flourish in the context of a growth surge, an economic growth surge, a great advance in economic productivity and wealth. You're not hearing me. I hadn't turned on the mic. Better now? Good. On the other hand, most of the people in the world, the ordinary men and women, are poor and disorganized. They remain poor and disorganized. But their perspective, their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. Sometimes also described as lower middle class or small business class. What do they want? What they want is to have a small farm, a shop in the city, a store, a trade for the provision of which they can charge a fee. The traditional stuff of petty bourgeois life. The number of these petty bourgeois in the world is now much larger than the number of proletarians. The historical basis of the left-leaning parties throughout the world was organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of industry, especially manufacture. And the dominant model of production, of the vanguard of production, was what we now call Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services on the basis of relatively rigid machines and production processes and semi-skilled labor. That vanguard is now in decline all over the world, and in the United States as well. And in its place, there has arisen a new vanguard, which we sometimes call the knowledge economy, an insular form of the knowledge economy. This new vanguard is multi-sectoral. It is present in every sector of the economy, but in each sector, it appears as a socially exclusive enclave or island, excluding the vast majority of workers and of firms. And from this insular nature of the new vanguard of production, momentous consequences follow. On the one hand, there is a slowdown of economic growth because the most advanced practice of production is denied to the great majority of the labor force. And on the other hand, the aggravation of economic inequality, the abyss between the advanced and the backward sectors of production overwhelms in its unequalizing consequences the ameliorative effects of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. That is to say, by progressive taxation on one side and by compensatory social entitlements on the other side. For there to be an advance hospitable to the creation of a new settlement, a new institutional and ideological settlement that would allow humanity to escape its thraldom, its enslavement to this dictatorship of no alternatives. There has to be a new growth project, a new project of inclusive growth. And for that project to occur in the real conditions of the class societies of the contemporary world, it would be necessary that there be a break in the national elite, a scission, a division between the predominant part, rentiers, financial or natural resource rentiers, and a productivist counter-elite. This productivist counter-elite would have to seek power, it would have to win power, and would have to offer the majority of the people an alternative to their default option, which is isolated, archaic family business, traditionally based on family saving and self-exploitation. Self-exploitation meaning you work a lot and you don't pay yourself anything that corresponds to this labor. So the active agent is in the majority of circumstances in the world, would have to be this counter-elite. And the social base, the principal social base, would be composed of the subjective petty bourgeoisie. And I use the term subjective petty bourgeoisie because the great majority of them are actually not members of a small business class. They're too poor for that. Right. In the United States, remember, for example, that most people don't have $500 on which they can draw on an emergency. So it's not accurate to describe them as a petty bourgeoisie, but their orientation, their aspiration is petty bourgeois. And therefore, it's the alliance of the productivist counter-elite with the subjective petty bourgeoisie, which in principle would be the instrument of liberation from the dictatorship of no alternatives. Right. And the majority of the essay is then occupied with outlining in somewhat greater detail the nature of the alternative political, economic, and social institutions which could begin to advance in the wake of the overthrow of the dictatorship.
So, I'm going to ask this. One of the questions that I have that I would love to discuss is, as you point out, from the knowledge economy for the few to the many is the ideal. It remains insular. It excludes the vast majority of business and workers. And there is in the first...
So one more word then to complement in the spirit of what you're speaking to now. So what are the large objectives of this project? Now, any project can be described at points relatively close to what exists or relatively far away from what exists. If it's very close, you can say that's feasible, but it's trivial. If it's very far away, you'll say that's interesting, but it's utopian. And thus, in the current of opinion, almost anything that can be proposed is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. But this, of course, is a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument. A programmatic argument is not a blueprint. It's a succession of steps. It's not architecture, it's music. And any programmatic argument worth thinking about can be explored at points relatively close or relatively far away from what exists. A contingent feature of the history of ideas complicates this dilemma and aggravates our programmatic aphasia, our difficulty of exploring alternatives. The difficulty is that the main body of ideas influencing the transformative political forces has been Marxism, or more generally, classical European social theory. Right. And Marxism, although it is centered on a revolutionary insight that the structures of social life are our invention, and therefore we should be able not only to remake them, but to understand them, allows this insight to be circumscribed and corrupted by a series of necessitarian illusions. One of them is that there is a small menu of alternative regimes of social, economic, and political life. These regimes are what Marx called the modes of production, of which capitalism is one. The second is that these regimes are indivisible. They either don't change or they change all at once. And therefore, there are two types of politics. There is the reformist management of one of these indivisible systems, and there is the revolutionary substitution of one by the other. And the third thesis is the thesis that there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible regimes in history. All of these ideas are false. And not only are they false, but they have become literally unbelievable. Almost no one believes in them. But they continue to use the vocabulary that was produced by this legacy of social theory. So we have this additional complication, this complication of our programmatic arguments, which we don't have a usable and credible way of thinking about structures and structural change. And that immensely aggravates the problem that I described. So given all of those limitations, and without attempting in the compass of this brief piece to develop another way of thinking, the main effort in the essay is focused on the outline of a few convergent programmatic projects. Structural changes to be implemented in a gradual, fragmentary, piecemeal way, because that's what real structural change in history is like. So one change is the democratization of the market economy and the creation, step by step, little by little, of a knowledge economy for the many that could replace the knowledge economy for the few that we now have in the world. A second project is the creation of a high-energy democracy that could replace the low-energy democracies of today, with a higher level of popular engagement in political life, a higher temperature of politics, with a faster tempo of politics, the rapid resolution of impasse in the service of the creation of experimental alternatives, and the exploration of the potential for partnership between strong central initiative and experimental diversity within each country, not just in federations, but also in unitary states. And the heart of the essay is the combination of that programmatic vision with the imagination of the agency of it. The partnership, the alliance of the productivist counter-elite with the subjective petty bourgeoisie. That's a brief sketch of this argument.
That's wonderful, thank you. You point out that the first stage is to uplift the uplift of small and medium-sized firms without them becoming behemoths. It's an uplift of small and medium-sized firms of technically equipped artisans.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily the first stage. What I would say is this. In the circumstances of the insular knowledge economy that I just mentioned, the situation is that there's an elite which does the real work and makes the real profits. And in fact, this elite, which is in command of the controlling heights of the insular knowledge economy, has discovered a way to bifurcate the process of production. The commoditized or routinized part, it subcontracts to firms and workers in remote parts of the world. And the lucrative and creative part, it keeps for itself. With the result that rather than spreading, this vanguardist productive practice does the opposite. It retreats further and further into its hyper-insularity. That's the situation. And in that situation, the vast majority of people are stuck in relatively unproductive jobs with little potential for an acceleration of productivity, and particularly in isolated, archaic family business. That's the situation that has to be addressed directly, but part by part, because there's no alternative to doing it piecemeal.
So my question is, to what degree does this vast majority of petty bourgeoisie serve as at least part of Trump's base? You point out, for example...
Well, that's a very particular question, right, about the United States, and about which I have no expertise. But what I would say is my impression is that what has happened is that there has been a division in the American working class between what you might call the credentialed and the uncredentialed parts. So the parts that are uncredentialed, that don't have higher technical education or college education, are the parts that are most likely to be attracted to the right-wing populism. And
from the...
there's no real right-wing version of this program that I described.
Correct, right.
So because if you try and look at its programmatic details, its policy with respect to industry, manufacture, is actually the same as of the left. That is, they want limits on plant closures, subsidies. What they add to that simply is the more vigorous restraints on immigration. But it's a hopeless policy because the old vanguard of production is not coming back. It's not coming back to life. All we can do is to buy a few more years for it as it gradually sinks. The only project with a chance is the creation of the knowledge economy itself, of the vanguard, on a new basis. And in the meantime, then, they appeal to this uncredentialed part of the labor force and exploit its insecurities and anxieties. That then is the right. And it's not a project of national reconstruction. Now, remember, to be fair, there are no projects of national reconstruction in the United States. And in general, in the contemporary society, there are no projects of national reconstruction without war or ruin, one or the other or both. And we have the example of Franklin Roosevelt, who, after all, had a war and an economic collapse as his allies, and even then had trouble doing it, and then ended up narrowing further and further the scope of his transformative project.
You mentioned also in this essay, and then I'd like to open up for questions and from you all, is that I found it fascinating. The European left committed its most fateful mistake in the 20th century when it demonized the petty bourgeoisie and drove them into the arms of the fascist right.
I think that's a fact, which is uncontroversial.
Yes, it's uncontroversial. To what degree is there risk in the United States of the petty bourgeoisie, instead of turning to the fascist right, of turning to Trump?
Well, I think they're always on the look for alternatives. Everyone is on the look for alternatives, right?
Yeah. Which, I mean, it highlights the significance of the piece that you wrote, is that...
So I think so what's the situation in the world in these North Atlantic countries? The typical social democrat or social liberal imagines to talk about a project, you need to talk about base. And how can you ask me, the politician will tell the critic, to find another base if I'll then jeopardize the only base I've had historically, and I'll end up with nothing. So this social democrat or social liberal politician feels caught between his shrinking historical base of manual labor, especially headquartered in capital-intensive parts of the production system, and a generic quality of life, middle-class politics. And almost invariably, they end up opting for the second, because the second seems the only one that's realistic. The first is a nostalgic operation, which can't really work either in the long term. So that's the particular practical dilemma that has to be broken. And it can't be broken without a project. That's the simple argument, right? But in these countries, in the European countries, in the United States, the tradition is to wait for a crisis in order to be able to enjoy the luxury of having a project. So because there's no crisis that's big enough, there can be no project. That's the attitude that prevails in the world. And that's the position of the so-called realists, although this position that I've described seems to me to be the quintessence of lack of realism.
Right. That's very well said. I'd like to have, yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. I have two questions. One is a clarifying question, and then the second one is, I guess it's also a clarifying question, but more so towards the substance. So I heard the mention of
No, so I outlined the project of a high-energy democracy, right? And I said one of the implications of this theory, of this Marxist theory, which is no longer believed in, is that there are two types of politics. Regimes are indivisible. And therefore, either you have the reformist management of a regime, the reformist management of capitalism in the Marxist vocabulary, or you have the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another, like the revolutionary substitution of capitalism by socialism.
Right.
So many countries in the world now, not speaking specifically of the North Atlantic, but of the world, many countries in the world are governed by ex-Marxists, disenchanted, disillusioned, and defeated Marxists. And the way they think is this: real change would be this revolution, right? It would be the revolutionary substitution of capitalism by socialism. But that change isn't in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left for us to do in our lifetimes? What's left for us to do is to humanize the economic order. And that we do by compensatory redistribution through social entitlements and through progressive taxation. And thus it is that in the United States, for example, many of the historical leaders of the Democratic Party seem to have it as their objective to make the United States look more like the Sweden of the 1970s or of 1970. Right. And that they would regard as success. Now that seems to me to be a direct recognition of political and ideological defeat, which they're defining as success. Right. That's the object of their ambition. So that's just another way of presenting the thesis of the dictatorship of no alternatives in the American circumstance. Yes?
I just want to make sure that, this is not to get political, but I just want to try to understand the distinction. I think it's important when you talk about this, the distinction between Trump and the fascist right. And I apologize if I'm ignorant on this, but
The distinction between
between Trump and the fascist right.
And who is the fascist right?
I don't know.
It was,
That this is a historical illusion. So
Yes,
in the 1920s and the 1930s, in Germany and in France, and in fact in all the European
yes,
countries,
and Italy.
the left identified the petty bourgeoisie, the literal petty bourgeoisie, the small business class, as the enemy.
Right. Right.
And they demonized the petty bourgeoisie.
Right.
This demonized class was soon to inherit the earth, right? Because
Yes.
there are now more of them in the world, if you define subjective petty bourgeoisie rather than literal petty bourgeoisie. There are more petty bourgeois in the world than there are proletarians. In a country like India, the vast majority of people are this subjective petty bourgeoisie.
Right.
That's who they are. So if you decide to declare a crusade against the petty bourgeoisie, you have your work cut out for you. So I think that this is a disastrous political campaign and an unnecessary campaign, because in the wake of the decline of conventional industry, of Fordist mass production, the tyranny of scale has been broken. And many of the most advanced enterprises in the world are in fact fabless. They have no physical apparatus. And they move people around. They're networks of contractual arrangements. So that's a world in which there could be an immense advance in combining decentralization with scale. And this gets us back to a discussion we had on the first day of class, in which I proposed as one of the central narratives for our argument in the course this idea. The United States was formed on this model of the petty proprietor, artisan, small-scale economy. That economy, like the slave economy of the South, was destroyed in the wake of the Civil War. And the question now is, can it be reinvented in some other form, which makes it, which gives it access to the new forms of the knowledge economy? That's the opportunity, that's the way in which this programmatic discussion about now combines with the historical discussion we were having before.
Right. Yes.
Is the definition of a project here necessarily something at the scale of like replacing capitalism, or could it refer to some sort of a galvanizing mission that like occurred within the context of capitalism, like for example, like trying to become a spacefaring civilization, or like, you know, a terraforming the planet view? Like can it be just a galvanizing?
Are you using your microphone?
I thought I was. Am I not?
Okay.
Do I need to repeat that?
What?
Do you want me to try to repeat?
Yeah, repeat that.
Repeat
Speak
it.
up.
Repeat the essence
yeah.
of what you said.
Are we defining project as something that has to be so lofty as it's replacing capitalism in terms of all the metastructures?
No, I said
No.
the opposite. I said a project like that is not for real. It's not for real because it's not realistic. It's that no one knows what it means. So it depends on the category of capitalism, the meaning of which is completely obscure. What does it mean? Does it mean the way the Americans now organize the market economy? Does it mean the way the Europeans or Japanese organize their market economy? It depends on, it implies that any particular instance of the market order is simply the instantiation of some pre-existing system that has its own laws. And that's just not true, that's false. All of that is false. And this is part of the confusion of the programmatic debate in the world, that people continue to use the vocabulary generated by a body of ideas in which they no longer believe.
Right.
So it's like the metaphorical use of a set of categories. And I don't see how we can achieve clarity operating in that way.
I guess I'm trying, are there seeds of these project ideas that you're aware of?
So every big project begins in a little project, right? And the practice of the political prophet must be to offer a down payment on the future that he proposes. He has to be able to point to something now and small which foreshadows what he wants later. That's just the nature of transformative practice and a prophetic discourse in politics. So of course, the knowledge economy for the many is not something that can jump out of the womb in a single piece. It has to come in pieces. It has to be foreshadowed. There have to be anticipations of it that can be offered as installments on something else. That's how things are. That's how the world changes.
Yes.
Sorry, I feel like I'm waving my hand around. I'm very energized by this idea of high energy democracy. A lot of the work I do is on civic engagement and just kind of starting somewhere, which I think is how I'm relating to what you're saying about high energy democracy. It's not trying to change the whole thing, but just starting somewhere,
Right.
And getting people involved. And so I do have a question on that, which is something that bothers me very specifically. I'm from New Orleans. I'm sure people have read this, but the book How to Kill a City, and I'm blanking on the author, but if somebody knows, jump in. But this idea resonates very strongly with what you were saying about how the elite and really just the concentration of wealth has really resulted in this just huge separation, right? And it's to an extent, the role of the elite to at least play some sort of role in changing that dynamic because of kind of some of the norms that they have set. And this book talks about late stage gentrification, meaning that the elite owns so much property in cities, really, in urban areas that used to be more, areas for community engagement. And in New Orleans in particular is one of the case studies in the book. What do you do when late stage gentrification means that people with so much money essentially own so many large parts of the city and they don't even live there because they have multiple residences. So they've essentially torn apart these communities where I guess the aspiring petty bourgeoisie could be having conversations. Is there a way to have these conversations even so without having that geographical continuity? Or is that something that has to be changed? And I don't know how that would happen. So anyway, thanks for bearing with the
Sure, but the conversation about the change in the living circumstances of different groups have to be associated with productivist projects. What are they going to be doing? So the problem now, the problem in this insular knowledge economy, which increasingly in more and more parts of the world is the circumstance of production, is that at the limit, a small elite is engaged in the vanguard. Everyone else in the country, to a greater or lesser extent, is consigned to some kind of make-work. And this is an intolerable situation. So it represents the condemnation to economic stagnation, but it's the antithesis of the promises of the democracy. And then there's all the stuff that goes on in between, which is like a distraction. Identity politics and so forth, in which has nothing to do with the structure. It's different ways of arousing the animosities within the people, of dividing them. To what end? To the end of perpetuating the existing situation. Yes.
Before you even get to the normative part of your argument.
Before you get to the what? Sorry?
Before, Professor, you even get to the normative part of your argument about what we should do to change the knowledge economy, there are two things about the knowledge economy that I'm not sure line up with your actual just objective description of it.
Yeah, but I didn't intend to have a full-fledged discussion of the knowledge economy now, right? Because that's going to get us off in another direction.
Yes, that's right. It gets us off in another direction. We'll discuss it much more later in the course. But go ahead and finish your question.
I was just going to ask very quickly. The first thing is this idea that, there's this insularity and that we need to sort of spread the wealth, and that's, the grand solution or the roadmap. It seems to me like the knowledge economy its structure can't facilitate that type of project for two reasons. The first is because it requires incredible skill. For example, to be a software engineer at Apple or Amazon who's designing algorithms that take in trillions of bytes of data and then distribute these programs.
Yeah.
And second is a company like Amazon, for its productivity, relies on its ability to centralize. So we can't have 70,000 Amazons because Amazon is good at what it does because it can take in all of the consumer data.
So, and there are all sorts of ways in which hierarchy and coordination can be combined with decentralization. That's the stuff of management. Right. That's what it's about. But we're going to have to discuss that in another in another setting. So there is a very particular point that is worth mentioning in this context, in which we're speaking about family business and scale and so forth, which is industrial mass production, the predominant paradigm of production up to the end of the 19th century, of the 20th century, was standardized production. And so there was a division between standardized production and craft production. Craft production is left behind as appropriate to an earlier stage of economic evolution. One of the technical characteristics of the knowledge economy is that it combines craft production with mass production. That is, it makes it possible through its characteristic technologies like additive manufacturing or 3D printing to have customized production at scale. And that changes the situation. So that's an example of the way in which the technological alternatives can make possible the upsurge of productivity in the family scale businesses. So that's the kind of thing that's discussed. Now that in turn leads to a broader subject of our discussion that has relevance for the future, which is that technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. Technology is not a train running on its own motion. It's a train that's running on the motion that we give it, in the direction that we impart to it. So how should we think in general about technology in a way that's not unpolitical? There are two ways of thinking about it. One way is it's the materialization of a channel between our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces to our advantage, like the magnetic force, the electrical force, the nuclear force, and our experiments in the technical division of labor, our experiments with the regime of cooperation. Technology is not like a thing, like an autonomous force in the world. It's just the materialization of that connection, and therefore entirely dependent not only on the evolution of science on one side, but on the evolution of our ways of cooperating with each other. The second way of thinking about technology is technology marks the line of division between what we have already learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. So everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and we then embody the formula or the algorithm in the mechanical device. The point of a machine is to do for us what we have already learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our most important resource, and in a sense, our only resource, which is our time, for the not yet repeatable. And thus, the machine should in principle be the device for a collaboration between the mind with imagination and the machine. Now, if we think in that direction, for example, the objective in the development of so-called artificial intelligence, of AI, should not be to produce something which is a proxy for the human mind. It should be the opposite.
Right.
The artificial intelligence should be as far as possible from the human mind, so that it can then complement the human mind. Then what we have is imagination. So the moves of the imagination are distancing from the phenomenon. After all, an image is the memory of a perception. To imagine it, you have to distance yourself from it. And then the subsumption of the phenomenon under a range of transformative variation. How do we understand something? We understand it by probing what it can become in the realm of the adjacent possible. That's the work of the imagination. And in a sense, our machines allow us to probe this realm of transformation in the adjacent possible, and our institutions do. So these projects that I just outlined of a knowledge economy for the many, a high-energy democracy, what are they? They are the collective institutional instruments of the imagination. Their purpose is to produce novelty, to produce alternatives, not just from the mind, but collectively in our practice. That's their whole nature. And that's how we advance. That's our ascent.
That's beautifully put. Yeah. That's. Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the counter elite. And in the article or in the PDF here, it talks about the counter elite and growth miracles. And you talked about like the counter elite having, you know, the marriage of productivism and nationalism. That's on page 16. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and how the counter elite can contribute to a better future.
So first, to explain, let me step back one moment. So this current vanguard in the world, the insular knowledge economy, is a characteristic expression of the path of least resistance. As every time there's a complex of innovations in the world, organizational, technological, whatever, the line of least resistance is to cut the innovation down to size, to accommodate it to the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. So, for example, we're going to have a knowledge economy. Let's cut it down to the size of a class order, because we are class societies. Right. So the knowledge economy is a characteristic instance of the path of least resistance. It's the form of the knowledge economy that is adapted to this social structure that we have, and that is least subversive of it. And this then produces a characteristic struggle in the world, that there are all the people who have stakes in the path of least resistance, and in having the innovation only in the form that will be not dangerous for their interests. And their ways of life and their conceptions. But the enemies of the path of least resistance have an advantage, which is the dormant potential of the innovations. So the knowledge economy, in a democratized form, has a huge potential which is being left untapped. So this was a theme in Marxism. Right. The problem is it's buried under all of the other stuff. But it's taking advantage of the practical power of the alternative to the path of least resistance. And making it count in the present debate.
Questions, comments? Yes.
Hi. Speaking more on the idea of counter elites, it seems to me that the sort of rising Silicon Valley power base on the West Coast seems to me to be a logical counter elite option in America, but as it's been seen the last few months especially, there's been sort of a right-wing turn from at least some of them. But they do have that productivist ethos and energy that you're describing. So I'm wondering if you think it's desirable and possible to try to convert that counter-elite power base into sort of a more pro-democratic vision.
Sure, but that's sort of out of my depth. California, that's beyond my imagination.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a great question. And I don't have an answer either. Yes?
I know a little bit about what you're asking about. I would just say that most of the people you're talking about were Democrats. They voted for Democrats for decades, or a year before. So I would say yes, it's definitely possible. But can't do what you're asking.
John, you signal when we should go on to discussion Christianity.
Okay, okay. Any other questions about Roberto's brilliant essay? Yes.
So Professor Unger said that petit bourgeoisie wants two things. The first one is to be their own masters. And the second one is to have a family business, family-based business. I can agree with the first aim, but I think I cannot agree with the second one because I think Professor Unger is too optimistic with the petit bourgeoisie aim. How so? Because for me, there are three options for this petit bourgeoisie. The first one is they could not want anything because they don't have the time for it. They work too much. They work like 16 hours per day and they don't have utopias. They cannot have prospections of anything because they don't have time. The second one is they want to become part of this financial elite. They want to have enough money to live off investments and to become like
To become rentiers.
Yeah.
And the third one, the last one, they want to become influencers and live from incomes of the digital world and at least in
But you're speaking of, you seem to be speaking of the petty bourgeoisie. I was speaking of the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Because the people I described, the vast majority of them are poor. They're not members of the small business class. The whole point was that the object of petty bourgeoisie is a small minority. The subject of petty bourgeoisie is the majority of humanity. That's the crucial division.
In fact, Roberto says, it was one of his many quotes, the subjective petty bourgeoisie in India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, and Nigeria, as well as the United States, form the majority of the people. They escaped abject poverty enough to dream the petty bourgeoisie dream, which was a form of artisanal work, small businesses, small land holdings, semi-skilled service provisions.
Yes, exactly.
That's the subjective petty bourgeoisie.
It seems to me that the attitude of the leftists to this class of people who are the majority of humanity remains dismissive and condescending.
Yes, yes.
To this day.
Yes, to this. That's right. Very condescending. Yeah. And I should, before we move on, I should say, and when I quoted Roberto's point about the fascist right, remember the United States, there was a fascist right in the United States, in the very in especially the Midwestern states, the states that were much less populated without major cities. But it's important to recognize the fascist right in the United States in the lead up and in some part even following the World War II. The United States was not immune, has not been immune to a fascist right.
So it's also important, this discussion should also remind us that the connection of reconstruction, institutional reconstruction to growth miracles reminds us that in this real world that we're in, the transformative projects travel on the ship of these sovereign states. And all these struggles about alternatives are mixed in with the question of the prosperity, survival, power of the state, and thus nationalism, which is, of course, entirely suppressed in Marxist theory.
Yes.
Could you do me a favor? Could you define how you're referring to fascist right? I mean, I would personally make an argument, not to get political, but that a large trend of the right-wing politics we're seeing today in America, and explicitly with a president who I see as, a wannabe authoritarian, that there are significant aspects of a fascist right. But you don't see, the way at least I'm interpreting it, you don't seem to be referring to that as present today. So could you just talk a little bit about how you're explicitly defining it?
Well, simply that in the late 30s and early 40s, the American fascists openly defined themselves, publicly defined themselves as fascists, and they celebrated that. So it's very much a part of their self-identity, which today virtually no one is describing himself or herself as a fascist because of what we now know that fascists had done and their extraordinary inhumanity. So the term is not celebrated in the United States today in the way it was in certain communities in the early 1940s, late 1930s. That's the difference.
But in that historical period, remember, one of the main ideological options was something close to fascism.
Yes.
And
yes.
guild socialism on the left
Yes.
was close to fascism.
Yes.
And you can see this very clearly in the evolution of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So at the end of the 19th century, in encyclicals like Rerum Novarum, the church defended social and economic rights with no institutional machinery, right? And then in the interwar period, the period between the two world wars, in the encyclicals of the 1930s, like Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, it proposed for the first time a clear doctrine of economic and social reconstruction. No socialism, no capitalism, corporatist communitarianism. That was the doctrine of the church. There's the suppression of class conflict, joint representation of workers and employers, capitalists, on these common boards. That's how they would run the whole economy. This situation now the church has abandoned its corporatist communitarianism. It still says in the abstract that capitalism and socialism are undesirable, but it doesn't offer the concrete alternative. And if you now look at the encyclicals, 100 and so many years after Rerum Novarum, it has returned exactly to the position of the end of the 19th century, which is propounding social and economic doctrines with no institutional machinery for their execution. That's an exact return to the situation before. So we're back with no alternatives and with the dictatorship of no alternatives.
Yes.
If I could just follow up on the question that you asked, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Couldn't we just argue today, or couldn't an argument be made that as things progress and what fascism progresses, right, and norms and it changes and it
Yes.
adapts, that we're basically in like we're in a late stage fascism where it's not gonna, it's so subversive in ways that like it's gotten smart enough to not say fascism because that would outrightly be rejected by Americans.
Right.
Maybe it calls itself another acronym,
Right.
right? That
It's a great question. And it hasn't been, it's a great question. It has not been studied that much, but I completely agree with you. It's like you can no longer celebrate the idea of being a fascist. That is it's going to destroy you. It's any vision for your future, for your society, and to call it fascist is going to bankrupt you. So
Yes,
you're,
but those are just words, right? I mean, it's become inconvenient.
Yeah,
There
but
are lots of inconvenient labels in the world.
that's true, but if your goal is to grow a group, call it a political group, you need to be careful in terms of how you
Of your words.
define your words. So essentially, it's about the degree to which words are so powerful. Words are immensely powerful, which we'll actually highlight next week with the prophets who were extremely
Careful about their words.
immensely careful about their words. And it's actually one characterization of movements that become successful and movements that fail in most respects, I would argue, is the degree to which their words are immensely powerful. Their words are both beautiful and powerful, and that attracts large numbers of people. That's the easiest way for me to describe it. Yeah.
I think following on from this, like we're giving a lot of weight to like self-ascription in terms of how we identify someone as like fascist or not. And I think, does this link to the way that you see like contemporary leftists being condescending towards the subjective petit bourgeois? Does that condescension come in the form of contemporary leftists seeing a subjective petit bourgeois and saying, oh no, if you understand yourself correctly, you're actually a proletariat, and it's in your best interest to see yourself as a proletariat. Whereas what we should be doing is recognizing their wishes, desires, and identities being in this subjective petit bourgeois form and addressing them on that basis. Is that what you're describing with the condescension towards that category of people?
I didn't quite get that.
The degree to which petty bourgeoisie is seen as a condescension. Is that correct?
Yeah, what does that act of condescension look like towards the petit bourgeois?
It's a very good question. I mean, one, it's a French term, but it's widely used in the United States, and bourgeoisie was seen as a form of celebration and identity. Bourgeoisie was the middle class, and the United States is always, even though it's often not the case, the power and the fundamental identity of the United States is middle class or bourgeoisie. So in that sense, those words still remain influential and powerful. Does that answer your question?
I think that answers the labeling aspect of it, but I think if I was to develop my question, it would be, so are we meant to be, in the United States, is there a different type of class politics that is required that recognizes these
No, it's not
aspirations?
fundamentally different from Europe, I think. I think the connotations of petty bourgeois are little things, right? Littleness, short horizons, small ambitions.
That's it from Europe, but
From Europe, yeah, no, but I'm talking about the word,
Oh,
and
Right.
and the small business class too.
Right.
You have your little business, you have your shop, you have your restaurant, as opposed to what? As opposed to the cosmopolitan techie, the elite.
Yes.
So that then the manipulation of symbols connects you with the world of money, gives you a much larger stage. You lift your horizons. That's the difference. And when you talk about a transformative project for the petty bourgeoisie, for the subjective petty bourgeoisie, which is worse, poor, they're poor. You're sort of jumbling the cards, right? You're mixing the categories. That's what's confusing, given this history of this nomenclature of political and social life. The petty bourgeois is to be humble, disciplined, organized, thrifty.
all good trades.
You know, all
So-called.
good traits, but not for these elites.
Yes. But
And-
another way of framing it is that, because, Americans use the term middle class far more than they use the term petty bourgeois.
They don't use the term petty bourgeois.
No, they don't. They don't use
And that's
it.
why I, on the first day of class, proposed a typology of the American class structure in which the word middle class did not occur.
Yes.
I said, there's the elite, the asset-holding elite, the billionaire class. There's the professional and business class. There's a small business class.
Right.
Under the small business class, there's the working class. The working class has a blue-collar and a white-collar segment. And the white-collar segment of the working class is what in general in the United States is called the middle class. So the middle class is a worker with a bourgeois identity, was the suggestion I made in that conversation. And under then the working class is the underclass, racially stigmatized in one way or another, and in the jobs in the secondary part of the labor market. That's the American class structure. That's the same class structure, basically, as all of the European societies. But that terminology is not accepted in the United States.
Right.
Because of its connotations, not because of its literal meaning.
And so following World War II and over the last 30 years, the working class, that terminology has increasingly morphed into middle class because of the decline of large working class organizations. But it still represents both when the term working class was used, it was still, they were not poor, they were not, they were still proud and still saw themselves as essentially equal Americans. But that term working class is not used as nearly as much as it was 50 years ago. Yeah.
Hi, so one question I had is about defining the small business class, because in my personal opinion, I feel like sometimes small business class can also fit into middle class. So I'm curious to know what the distinction is for that class.
So are you asking who are the small business class? I don't think it's very mysterious. It's the people who literally own small businesses.
Right.
Or who provide a service which is in effect a small business. It's a service business also.
So are we saying those people are not middle class?
Well, don't ask me what middle class means. I think the term middle class is a mystification.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't ask me what middle class means. Ask whoever believes in that in the use of that word.
And that's right. I mean, the middle class was essentially an invented term in the United States. It's not used. Well, in Britain, there's an upper middle, lower middle, middle class. They're much more smaller categories. Lower middle, upper middle, and then aristocrats. But the United States, very aristocrats, the term aristocrat is not used very much at all. It never has been. Yes.
Speak about, although it's one part, we must imagine an alternative to the dictatorship defined by no alternatives, or else we don't really have hope of overthrowing it. And you say that this task is made possible.
Could you speak up a little bit and start over? Sorry.
Yeah. So you talk about how, although it's one part, we should be imagining an alternative to the dictatorship, where we don't have hope of overthrowing it. And you say that in this task we have to evoke the social agent.
So you go, what?
You have to invoke the social agent. Is that right? You have to.
Of overthrowing.
Part of a transformative project, you can't just have the project. You have to You have to have an affinity, a marriage of the project to a base. Now, every powerful project helps create its own base, right? It doesn't take the base as just an antecedent condition. It co-evolves with its base. So that's part of the argument. But you have to have some idea of where in society you look for your friends. That's the argument we were having. And I think that, in fact, there is a wealth of possible friends because this subjective petty bourgeoisie, not the literal small business class, is the majority of people in the world.
Yes.
Hello, it's me again. I'd like to humbly suggest, and I'm not the first person in the world to have this idea, obviously, but we might be forgetting the artistic counterculture in this discussion.
I'm sorry, getting the what?
The artistic counterculture in this discussion as a group. And I think that the reason that this group might be useful, and by this I mean literal artists, I mean, maybe that's a question, maybe we could include academics, I'm not quite sure, but talking about artists, I'm a professional artist, and I would say that the goal of the counterculture, right, is not to participate in the stereotypical capitalist economy. I mean, we have to make money.
Agree. And the artistic community doesn't use, you probably know this, they don't use the term middle class or upper class. No, that's exactly right.
And I think it's interesting because it's probably one of the more stable
Yes,
classes in this country, but really over time in any society. And I think it's interesting because the liberal elite, there is like a respect for the artistic counterculture, or at least, I don't know if it's respect, but it's more of like an understanding. I mean, there's definitely a separation, but I mean, financially, frankly, the artistic counterculture lives like the subjective petty bourgeoisie or even the proletariat, or I don't know where you'd place us, but I think that artists could serve as a bridge because there's already narratives happening in the artist community and kind of a baseline there of these kind of conversations and using art as that way to exercise the human imagination. It's almost like its own little bubble of high energy democracy. Of course, like, I forget your name, but you described the financial constraints of the petty bourgeoisie. Of course, there are financial constraints that keep artists from having these kind of conversations, but artists, kind of by definition, again, are part of this economic group, but there's this interplay between artists and the liberal elite and artists and the petty bourgeoisie and
That's
the art itself.
That's a very good point. There is a profound, there's a distinction for artists and an interplay between artists and the bourgeoisie, and you see that in, we'll see that next week, and especially with someone like Melville and Lincoln, who grew up with nothing. I mean, they grew up with nothing. Melville's grandfather was extremely wealthy, I mean, for a variety of reasons, mostly that his family lost all the money. That's why he went on a whaling ship, is because he had no money, and whaling was a way to earn money, and that's what inspired him to write his Moby Dick and a lot of his literature. And Lincoln grew up dirt poor, completely dirt poor. But at that time, I mean, Melville did see himself and occasionally use the term artist, but the idea of an artist is much more a term of the late 19th and early 20th century, in part in response to industrialization, that I'm proud of being an artist because I don't have to, I'm not part of the maw of industrial society. I mean, that's part of the beauty and the significance of an artist. Yeah, that's very good.
You want to begin a discussion now of Christianity?
Yes, yes.
So the topic next week are the American prophets, the message of the American prophets. And there's no way to discuss the message of the American prophets without having a view of Christianity, right?
Yes.
So, but actually it's very difficult to have a view of Christianity to determine what Christian Orthodox is. So I wanted to begin by a few remarks. And you stop me. Keep
Okay.
stopping
No,
me along the way.
No, keep going.
So, of course, Christianity is one of the three Semitic monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It has very specific characteristics. I think it's impossible to understand what the dominant ideas have been in the United States without forming a view of Christianity. Now, in interpreting Christianity, we have an initial difficulty, which is that the official interpretation of Christianity has been filtered through Greek philosophy. So Christian theology was theology taught under the light of Aquinas in the short term and then long term of Aristotle, the Greek philosophy of being. And the Greek philosophy of being is a very strange element to mix with Christian theology, because in some senses it's a contradiction. What are the elementary philosophical conceptions, not the theological conceptions, but the philosophical conceptions which are intrinsic to Christianity, very closely related to it? First, that the world is real. The world is not some kind of allegory. And that the most important thing about the universe is that it is what it is, rather than something else. It's real and contingent. The second is that time is real. Time is not an epiphenomenon. Time is the most real thing that there is in nature. Time is the susceptibility of everything in nature to change. And Greek philosophy is in tension with Christianity, because Greek philosophy is ambivalent in recognition of the reality of time. The main tradition of Western thought, from the Greeks to 20th century physics, says in effect, time is real but not completely real, because what is most real in the world, according to this tradition, are things that don't change. The elementary constituents of nature, as described by the standard model of particle physics, and at another level by the periodic table. And the regularities, the laws, symmetries, and constants that govern this elementary constituency, these elementary components. They don't change. They're forever. Now, this must be false, I would say, philosophically. There's nothing in the world that doesn't change. Everything changes sooner or later, including these supposed laws, symmetries, and constants, and the elementary constituents of nature. So time is real, but the thing that is most real is not in time, as opposed to a view, I think the Christian view, which says time must be real, really real, fully real. Time is not just provisionally real or partly real, because the whole plan of God's creation and redemptive activity is in the medium of time. And time is the very substance of the world in which we change. So the world's for real, time's for real, and not just partly real. Third, the new is possible. If the new were not possible, nothing in this plan of creation and redemption would be imaginable. And we have this godlike power to participate in the creation of the new. The creation of the new is a perpetual font of divine energy, which is in us as well. Fourth, history has no closed script. The script of history is not pre-written. There aren't these laws, for example, that Karl Marx described that determine the script of history. Fifth, the individual human being, embodied spirit, has unfathomable depth. And we're so deep, it's so impossible to imagine the limits of a human being that we are obscure to ourselves as well as to others. Heraclitus said, among the pre-Socratics, the soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited. And one could take this principle in the Christian context as well. And now I think the sixth thesis is that the ordinary has more potential, more value, more significance than the noble. So the radical transvaluation of values is the source of true insight and true good in the world. Not the noble, not the rare, not the special, but the ordinary, and especially ordinary humanity. That's the elementary kind of proto-philosophy backdrop of Christianity as a philosophical conception. But it's already incompatible with the major tradition of Western thought, including Western science. Now my second question. Shall I go on?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. My second question is, the religion of Christianity as a faith presents a series of scandals to the human mind. We could call them the scandals of reason. Well, what are they? First, the supersession of normal causal connections in the world by the miraculous activity of the incarnate God and of some of his followers. And the events attending the birth and incarnation of Christ are themselves miraculous, like, for example, the virginal birth of Christ. Second, the connection in Christianity, as in Judaism and in Islam, of a universal message with a particular plot. The universal message is carried by the particular contingent plot. Why was the incarnate God born in a provincial province of the Roman Empire at a particular time? And not, for example, earlier, when he might have helped save more people, or later, when his message might have been better received and understood, and so forth. These questions are unanswerable in Christianity. And the third scandal of reason, perhaps the most fundamental, is the incomprehensibility of God. So there are three conceptions of God available to us in the theological tradition. God as person, an anthropomorphic conception of God. Humanity interacts with God the way people interact with one another. The second, the philosophical conception, God as being, and the objections to those two are obvious. And the fact that they face those objections then leads to the third conception, which is purely negative, and that's in theology called the via negativa. God as non-person and non-being, and that survives in the mystical counter-traditions within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So the religion is composed of these scandals, something that cannot be comprehended by the mind, and which are truly mysteries. Theologically, not just epistemologically or philosophically. Now I come to the next stage in this exploration of Christianity. And I ask the question, what is the essence of Christianity? A momentous question in the history of Western thought. And I make a proposal. The essence of Christianity lies in the connection between two themes or two ideas. The first theme is the theme of the infinite. Every human being is embodied spirit. The spirit, the divine force, embodied in a particular person who is on the way to death and who immensely transcends all the particular determinations of his existence. Fundamental dialectic of the human being is this dialectic between finitude and transcendence. And the infinite is another name for transcendence. And that is manifest in every part of human experience. So in every moment, in every part of our existence, everything in our existence points beyond itself. Everything. So, for example, the life of desire. We desire the unconditional. We're surrounded by only the conditional, the relative, and we desire the unconditional and the absolute. All of our desires are proxies for other desires which we are unable to name. So, for example, from one another we desire recognition, a guarantee of a place for us in the world. And every human desire of us is then the bearer of this desire for something else, for something more. That's transcendence. And the spirit is simply the designation of the agent, the embodied agent, the creative agent, and this impulse to supersede, to go beyond, to overcome. And the second theme in Christianity is the theme of the sovereignty of love in the organization of moral experience. Christianity is not the religion of charity, of altruism. Christianity is the religion of love. God is love, is the most general and radical expression of love. And every human being then, we are all human beings bound together by an invisible circle of longing and love. The relation between these two themes, the theme of the infinite and the theme of love, is the most subtle and profound part of Christian theology. Now, there is, however, a difficulty, and now I go on to the next step. The history of Christianity is a history of heresy. And most of the space, almost all of the space on the surface, are heresies. So what stands in the world as representatives of the Christian faith are heretical expressions of Christianity. So the orthodoxy is like a fading horizon, retreating from us all of the time, and we're unable to cling it. Now, the problem of the heresies, which occupied almost the whole space of the history of Christianity, presents itself in two domains. The first domain is the relationship of the self to society, in which, on the one hand, now I'm going to adopt a method which is actually the method of patristic theology, of calling the heresies by the names of individuals. So, With respect to the relation of the self to the social world, let me call one heresy the Hegelian heresy. And that's the idea that there is a form of the social order which is the consummate expression of the divine desire, the divine plan. There's an absolute horizon of our political progress. That's what I'm calling the Hegelian heresy. The other heresy, let me call the Sartrean heresy, and it's the romantic or existentialist heresy. The essence of the Sartrean heresy is that we can't escape the rule of a structure, and every structure is flawed, but all we can do is shake the structure. We can return it to its liquid moment, like romantic love in contrast to the routines of married life, or a bureaucratic order of the state in contrast to the mob in the streets. The liquid moment is the real moment. That's the moment of life. And the institutions are the hand of Midas killing the spirit. That's the Sartrean heresy. The Sartrean heresy is a form of despair. It's a despair about our power to change the relation between spirit and structure and to create spirits that are more hospitable to structure. Now, the whole history of Christian theology with respect to this question of the relation of the self to society is occupied almost entirely by the variations of these two heresies, either the Hegelian heresy or the Sartrean heresy. And no position which would do justice to the Christian faith in the combination of these two views. And now the second domain is the domain of the relation between the self and others, Christian ethics. What is the Christian image of life? According to what we read in most of the books of theology, it's some form of Christian charity, altruism.
Right. And love.
But Christianity is not the religion of altruism. Christianity is the religion of love.
Right.
And there's a fundamental difference between love and altruism. So altruism may require sacrifice, and even the sacrifice of one's life, but it's no inner jeopardy. The initial difference between altruism and love is that love has an imaginative preliminary. The task in love is to imagine the other. That's the first task. Altruism has no epistemic imperative, although it may demand extreme sacrifice. Love presupposes a fundamental equality, for there can be reciprocal recognition and acceptance. Altruism requires no such exchange of fundamental recognition and acceptance. And therefore, altruism imposes this intimate vulnerability which love doesn't. Love imposes this fundamental vulnerability which altruism doesn't. But we don't have any account in the doctrinal works of this ethic. We don't know what it looks like. We don't understand its relation to society. All we have are these images, these heretical images of what a Christian life would be. Now, we come to the next point. In the history of Christianity, a particular moment is the moment of the middle period of the history of Protestantism in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this was a very anomalous moment. This was the moment of Schleiermacher, a Protestant theologian, of Madison, a politician, in which there was a privatization of the sublime, of the divine. It's the moment of these English sects that proliferated in the United States,
Puritans, Quakers,
like the Puritans, Quakers.
especially.
The Christianity of the inner light. And forming then the basis for what would later become the predominant American form of sociability, which I characterized in an earlier class as a cheerful, impersonal friendliness. This middle distance, right, in which Schopenhauer's porcupines huddling in the night, pricking each other with their spines, going back and forth and settling into this uncomfortable middle distance. That's the has always been the predominant American form of sociability. And what then are the peculiar heresies to which the Americans, having come out of this particular version of Christianity, have suffered? Two great taints on the message of their prophet. Their prophets, like Whitman, Emerson,
Melville.
have this image. The individual is godlike. The individual humanity doesn't just interact with God. Humanity is part of the inner life of God.
Or God is part of the inner life of the human, of the individual. That God is
God's
within.
redemptive activity goes on within the soul of every individual human being. And again, this against the background of this privatized Protestantism of the 18th and 19th centuries, then has led to the grip of two heretical heresies of Christianity. One is a disturbance in the imagination of the relation between self-fashioning and solidarity.
Right.
So the American thinks he must make himself, he must build himself, he must become the agent, rich, powerful, effective in the world, and then he will be generous. So generosity is, as it were, the afterthought to self-fashioning. What's denied in that, and what is unchristian, is the denial of the way in which solidarity is internal to self-construction. And not some later dialectical moment, but there from the beginning. And the second heresy has been an idolatrous attitude to the institutional arrangements of the country, the height of which is the cult of the Constitution. The cult of the Constitution is the extreme idolatrous forms, like the golden calf, the complete perversion, which is the extreme form of this heresy, and of what I called before the Hegelian heresy. And therefore, if that is true, then it's not enough to interpret the message of the American prophets. It's also necessary to correct the message. And especially to wipe it clean of this double taint on the prophetic message of the twin heresies suggested to them by this history of the privatized form of Christianity, which they developed among themselves in the construction of their national life. That's what I wanted to say, just by way of a preliminary to our discussion.
That is beautifully stated. I mean, so just to pick up on some of the points that you've made is that Americans from, I've mentioned this, from really the revolution to today, faith has been foundational to their identity, both as individuals and as a national identity. And that has led from early on to this notion of, the phrase you put it, as self-fashioning, is that, that Americans, not an exclusive, but a dominant or very robust form of Protestant Christianity is, in the United States, is that the individual should be always in a state of evolution and continual flux.
And we're going to come 2 weeks from now to a discussion of my country, of Brazil.
That's right.
Which has been radically transformed
Yes.
by the presence of this American teaching.
Right.
So we now have in our country 60, 70 million people, evangelicals, Protestant evangelicals, originally inspired by the American religion. And it's as if we had in our society formed in a completely different tradition. Slave society, like the United States. This large minority, which is like a Trojan horse in our country, of these spiritual aliens who have now adapted this other idea of life, which has immense political significance.
Yes, yes.
And we now have this dialogue with the United States goes on now inside us.
And that this form of self-fashioning has also manifested itself in numerous different articulations of Christianity, which is why in the United States there are so many more denominations of Christianity than in most other countries.
But this also creates the potential for the presence of the prophetic element in politics.
Yes, yes, very much so. The presence of the prophetic in politics, but also to a degree in culture. One need not be a politician to be prophetic. One can be a leader or even
And
before.
the content of the prophecy in a democratic society is always some higher form of collective life.
Yeah.
That will be made available to the people and not just to the individual believer.
Yes, yeah. It's also why the United States has, there are more new religions in the United States than virtually any other country. And which lends itself to new forms of self-fashioning. And the figures we'll discuss, or the figures we'll discuss next week, Emerson, Whitman, Melville, Lincoln, are one example. We could have a course of that includes a wide variety of believers and how they redefine religion. We'll see that a bit later in the course with other examples. But Emerson, Whitman, Melville, and Lincoln, in very different ways, articulated distinctive relationships between God, the nation, and themselves and their followers. And that the power of religion was profound in all four of them.
And these American prophets we'll be discussing next week were, after all, Christian prophets.
Yes, they were Christian prophets.
And they proposed not just a transformation of their country, the United States, but also a certain way of constructing Christianity, of developing Christianity.
Yes. In a way that fit the nation at the time, which is, I mean, it was still, all of them were defined themselves as Northerners, and all of them advocated in very different degrees a vision of democracy that's connected to Christianity, inseparably connected to Christianity in very different ways, each of them.
Tocqueville says at the beginning of his book, in the beginning of his book about the Ancien Régime, he says, every great political revolution is at the same time a religious revolution.
Yes.
A revolution in consciousness.
Yes.
And not just a revolution in the institutional arrangements. And this is very clear here from the side of spirit, as it would be from the side of the institutions.
Right. And as I said, these American prophets, and there are many of them, they all see themselves as celebrating a sense of being continually evolving. And in the positive way is that their faith and their Americanness reflects their understanding